Hello and welcome back to SAS Bootcamp Week 5 Video 3. Um, so far, we've learned some pretty useful things within PROC SQL. We've recapped a lot of the content covered in the past 4 weeks using a PROC SQL, and we've managed to densely pack a lot of commands using one PROC SQL to read into SAS. But really, the things that we've seen so far are not why PROC SQL is popular. These things we've seen so far can be done in data steps just as efficiently. The stuff that PROC SQL is really efficient for, the stuff that I use PROC SQL for all the time while doing my research, is basically to deal with this topic that we've referred to in the past few weeks as reading across rows. Reading across rows is basically when you are trying to create a new variable or a value for a variable in one row based on values of a variable in a different row of data. That reading across rows is not something that the program data vector, which SAS utilizes, can do effectively, but PROC SQL is very, very good at it. In fact, the past couple of weeks, we've talked about, while talking about reading across rows, we've talked about first dot and last dot variables. And I mentioned briefly that I don't really use first and last dot variables much. I do use them every once in a while when there's not an alternative, but I don't use those things much to define those buckets and to do those summaries. I don't use first and last dot variables. I use PROC SQL. So let me talk about the next PROC SQL command, the group by command. Right? Here it is. So this is the code that we are going to learn how to write. It is easier to understand this code if I don't go line by line. So let me first begin with this. We have the create table statement within SAS right after the PROC SQL statement. But we are going to use for this step, we are going to use the Benny_visit file. Let me open this file up for those of you that do not remember this file from the last week. So this file is mocked up to look like a regular outpatient visit dataset that you might come across in a claims file. There is a Benny ID variable and a visit variable with the date on which provides the date on which the individual visited a healthcare provider. You can see that Benny ID 1 went to the doctor 3 times. They have 3 visits. Benny ID 3 has gone to the provider 4 times with 4 individual dates of service, so on and so forth. So what we are doing in this particular example is we are creating buckets, and the bucket or the grouping variable we are interested in is the Benny ID themselves. Right? We want to group by the individual, and we want to sum across the rows of the visit variable for each individual. Traditionally, we would have defined first.BennyId, last.BennyId. We would have had a retain statement, and then we could have created new variables which summed or counted or does any of those things. Instead, we are not going to do any of those things. We're going to simply add a group by statement. That's it. We're going to add a group by statement, and we're going to list the grouping variable in that group by statement. If you want to group by more than one variable, where, for example, 2 weeks ago, we talked about grouping by more than one variable, right? We talked about grouping by type of the Pokemon and perhaps whether it was legendary or not. And we just listed them in the PROC sort, where we sorted the data set, and then in the by statement in the data step. In PROC SQL, number one, you don't have to sort the data set before you group the data. The sorting is automatically done within PROC SQL, and it's implicit, so you don't have to explicitly sort your data set. 2, you just list in the group by statement as many variables as you want to define your buckets. So if your grouping variable is simply the individual, just list Benny ID. If you want to list Benny ID and gender or something else, you can just separate those variables by a comma and list as many variables as you want in the group by statement. Right? So once you've defined the new dataset's name, and then you've listed the name of the dataset that the data is coming from and your group by statement, then you have to deal with the select statement. The select statement is the most complicated part of a PROC SQL that uses a group by statement. And it is complicated, not because it is difficult to write, but there are so many things you have to do as part of good coding practice that if you don't follow, SAS will not throw you an error, right? The log will not detect any syntax errors. It will give you an output, but your outputs will be incorrect. So programming discipline is very important when using PROC SQL. And this goes back to my earlier comment in the first video which said it's easy to make errors in SAS, it's harder to debug errors in SAS, in PROC SQL, excuse me. So let's see how the select statement is structured when you have a group by statement. So when that group by statement is present, the first thing you need to include within your select statement is the grouping variable, right? The grouping variable has to be the first variable in your output data set. Make that a rule. If you don't do it that way, PROC SQL will still run. Don't get me wrong. It's not syntactically wrong, but it is not good coding practice. Whatever your grouping variable is, list that in the very beginning of your select statement before you write anything else. And if you have more than one grouping variable, list all of them right there. Once the grouping variable is listed in a select statement, you should not have any other variables listed which are not summary level variables. So let's go back to this data set. In this data set, we are defining that Benny ID is our grouping variable, right? The visit variable is not a grouping variable, which means the visit variable cannot be present in the group data set. So if we are rolling up to an individual level where there is only one row per individual, that visit variable should not be present in that data set as it looks like it is, as it looks right now, right? It has to be summarized before it gets there. So what I mean to say is that every non-grouping variable in your output data set has to be a summary variable, right? A summary variable is things such as taking an average or counting or taking the sum or the minimum or max. There are several summary functions out there, and I have listed examples for many of them in this particular PROC SQL. The goal that you have to try to accomplish is that every single variable, and I'm repeating this right now, every single variable that's not a grouping variable has to be summarized. And we'll talk about summary functions in just a little bit, but let me also talk about that distinct statement here. That distinct statement here is actually not required as part of syntax. I could have listed this without the distinct statement and it would have worked just fine. But as good coding practice, again, in PROC SQL, anytime you use the group by statement, please remember to also use the distinct statement so you can make sure that if you've made other errors in your code, this will help basically cancel out some of those errors. Using that distinct statement ensures that there is no duplication in your data set, which may be present if you don't work through the rest of your variables appropriately. You'll see what this means when you work through PROC SQL on your own, but I would strongly encourage that you use that distinct command whenever you use a group by option. Okay, having said that, let's talk about summary variables on the non-grouping variables, summary functions, excuse me, on the non-grouping variables. The summary functions I'm going to introduce right now are the sum function, the average function, the min and the max function, and then the count and the count distinct functions. And these are all pretty easy to understand, right? The sum function basically adds up the variable that you are interested in across all the rows of the grouping variable. So if I use the sum function across the visit variable, it will add these three dates together for individual one, which would be pretty meaningless, right? But you can do that if you want. And if you had some other numeric value in that variable, you can basically sum across those rows by simply writing the sum command right here, right? This followed by the variable name in parentheses, and then you have to follow it up with a new variable name after the as command, right? So if you're using the min function, which takes the minimum of all the values of that variable within each group, so the minimum for visit variable within each Benny ID is listed as minimum, and within parentheses the variable, followed by as, and then whatever name you want to give the new variable. The minimum of the visit variable is the first visit. Similarly, the maximum gives you the largest number, so the maximum of the visit variable is the last visit, which I've also added a format command here. I think the format command was not needed in this particular example, but it also demonstrates how you can club those summary functions with the format function. And then you can also use a summary function called the count function. The count function basically just counts the number of visits that are happening in your, counts the number of rows present in your data set. So it takes that visit variable and it counts how many times does this visit variable have a value, have any value, even a missing value, for example. How many times does it have a value in each bucket? So it basically counts how many visits, and I'm saving that into a variable called num_visits. But with the count summary function, you can actually get a little more nuanced. You sometimes don't want to count the number of visits, but you want to count number of distinct visits, right? Number of unique dates that a visit occurred. If you want to do that, you just include the distinct command within the parentheses after your count command. So you would write count and open parentheses. Instead of just listing the name of the variable, you would list distinct variable name, which means it will only count each unique occurrence of that variable within each group. So it's easier to understand this with the count distinct visit example. Here, what the code is saying is it wants SAS to count how many times a unique visit variable occurred. So if an individual visited the doctor twice on one day, so if this 13th _ August 2010 date was replicated here, if it was the same date, then both of those would be counted as just one when you use the count distinct command. If you use the count command, those would be counted as 2 rows because they are present on 2 different rows. So those are the examples of all the summary functions you can use, right? I have not shown the sum function or the average function here, but if you understand how the min and the max work, understanding the sum and the average should also be pretty straightforward. So let's go ahead and execute this command and check our output. There's a log, here's our output. So now we have only 1 row of data per each individual. Remember, earlier we had 22 rows of data where there were duplicates in the Benny ID. Now we have just 1 row for each individual, and you'll see that the variables following this are all summary variables. All non-grouping variables in my output dataset are summaries of one form or the other. The first visit took the minimum of the visit variable. It's not been formatted here, so this is displayed as a SAS date. The last visit variable took the maximum of the visit dates, and it is formatted because we use the format command with the format date 9 is listed here. We also counted number of visits. So for example, I know the first beneficiary had 3 visits because that individual had 3 rows of data in the first data set. The second individual had 4 rows of data and then 7 rows of data here, so on and so forth. The number of Benny IDs counts number of distinct Bennys within each grouping variable. You will recognize that this is a little redundant and unnecessary, right? If our grouping variable is Benny ID, then there can only be 1 Benny ID within each group. And that's why you are seeing that there is only 1 Benny ID within each group. Now this number could have been equal to this number because there were 3 rows of each data for 3 rows of data for individual 1, but this only says 1 because it is count distinct, not any count, right? If it counts any value, this would have been 3 because Benny ID 1 showed up 3 times in 3 rows in that first bucket. But because I said count distinct, only 1 distinct or unique Benny ID was discovered in that bucket, which was Benny ID 1. So that number is 1. And that is the same for every other individual in this data set. Finally, the number of distinct dates tells you if there were any dates that were duplicated across the rows within one group. And in our data set, that didn't happen. So every single date was unique and different from each other. So when counting distinct dates as opposed to number of visits, the numbers aren't really different in this example. And that is how you use group by. And you will recognize that when using group by to read across rows with PROC SQL, you don't have to tell SAS to remember values of a certain variable in a retain statement or a lag statement. You don't have to use these complicated mathematical functions for adding or counting rows. Instead, you can use these neat little functions with min and max and count or count distinct or sum or average to make your life really easy. So anytime I wanted to do grouping data sets within my research, I always use PROC SQL with the group by statement, and I encourage that you use those liberally in those situations as well.